Welcome to the SEI Podcast Series, a production of the Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute. The SEI is a federally funded research and development center sponsored by the U.S. Department of Defense. A transcript of today's podcast is posted on the SEI website at sei.cmu.edu/podcasts.
Hello, welcome to the SEI Podcast Series. I'm Matthew Bukovic, Technical Director of Cyber Risk and Resilience here at the Software Engineering Institute. Today I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Dan Costa and Randy Trzeciak. We're here to discuss insider risk and the mitigation of insider risk. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
So I was hoping that you could start by just maybe explaining your roles here and maybe your path to the SEI. So let's start with Dan.
So I'm the technical manager for enterprise threat and vulnerability management, leading two bodies of work here, our insider risk team, as well as our applied network defense group. I've been at the SEI for 12 years now, and I came here by way of a short career as a software engineer and actually came here to do some contract software development, helping to write assessment data collection and analysis capabilities for an insider threat assessment that the team was currently developing. So since here, I've had a chance to wear a lot of different hats kind of within this insider risk team. As an individual contributor, then team lead, now technical manager, I've had the great pleasure of going a lot of different places, working with a lot of different people on some really interesting problems, whether that was on afloat platforms or at the Pentagon or within the private sector. We've really jammed a lot of life into the 12 years I've had it here at the SEI, and it's one of the reasons why I'm still here.
Thanks, Dan. Randy?
Thanks, Matt. So I'm the Deputy Director of Cyber Risk and Resilience here within the CERT division of the SEI. My transition to an educational environment started when I was working at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C. My background was historically in database development, design, application building, software development, but really one of the foundational components of database is database security, which was a great transition to focus on cyber security when it comes to protecting of data and critical assets within organizations. I was fortunate to have worked in a number of places across Carnegie Mellon, including different parts of the SEI, but really the foundational work of insider threat, I was very fortunate to have been part of a core group of three that really started on the early days of research into insider threat. That's evolved into a number of opportunities that provided ways to transition that knowledge out to different sectors within the Department of Defense, the federal government, law enforcement, industry, and academia. And it provides a great opportunity to do foundational research into a specific area with a mandate to transition out to broad communities. And I really appreciated that opportunity throughout the number of years I've been at the SEI, and that's totaled now 21 years at the SEI.
So we have a wealth of experience here, and you've been working in this domain for quite some time. It sounds like, Randy, maybe from the inception of this work here at the SEI, essentially.
Absolutely. The early work in insider threat started back in 2001, looking at foundational incidents of insiders causing harm to organizations, and that's evolved continuously into a corpus of insider data, of which we use as the foundation empirical data to build the models and patterns of insider activity.
And certainly identifying and mitigating insider risk is part of our mandate here, as one of those organizations protecting the nation, and one of the things that makes us unique as an FFRDC. So thank you for joining me to discuss this. Clearly, I have two prominent experts. My first question, you were doing insider risk before the pandemic, and then we suddenly decentralized the workforce in ways we'd never anticipated with a technology stack that was not really intended to monitor folks in a way that may detect some of the things, as I understand, that you look for. So questions about the way that, or a question rather, about how the remote work pandemic, post-pandemic world is maybe changing expectations about employee behavior monitoring, insider risk detection. Just how has it changed the domain?
Well, I'll begin by saying, let me start by what hasn't changed. Certainly the need to address insider risk in an organization, whether that's in a physical building or that's a remote workforce working from home or some other location, there still is a need to address insider risk within organizations. So that's the foundation that's continued over the course of the pandemic in the hybrid or completely remote workforce. Some of the things that we found is that from the very early and rapid transition from in a workplace to outside the workplace, the tools were typically configured to do basic anomaly detection. when I look for things like when do people traditionally work, where do they work from, the location, the tools were configured to have a pretty standard baseline of what was expected or normal or presumed good activity, and looking for those specific anomalies within the context of the security operations. When the workforce goes completely remote from a Friday to a Monday, obviously some of the tools will automatically start generating alerts just from the proximity of where your workforce is connecting to and from. So tools such as user activity monitoring or user behavioral analytics, those types of capacities would automatically start generating alerts just from the distance from which the employees are connecting into your systems. The way they're connecting and what they're doing has changed also as well. But also, as we start looking at the research we've done, we focus primarily on malicious insider activity, but we also focused on the accidental, the non-malicious as well. So thinking about a remote workforce now with the pandemic working from home. In the early days of the pandemic, everyone was working from home. All students were at home. So the employees with children and maybe elderly parents, the care from home, the distractions in a work from home posture, at least initially, were pretty significant. And some of those anomalies that were being detected could be because of the distractions in the workplace that are now transitioned to the distractions at home. So looking for ways, but you can try to detect the malicious and non-malicious. The tools needed to have a longer time to start baselining what the normal or presumed good activity would be from a workforce which isn't physically in a facility owned and operated by the organization.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So what I've heard is we need to reestablish what the profile of essentially standard behavior is. Things aren't anomalous; they're just different now. So it's a really important insight for folks that are. And Dan, thoughts about that?
Well, we went through really 3 stages of this. Everybody's normal kind of fundamentally shifted overnight. Then it took time to kind of re-baseline what normal looked like. And what we saw was that took organizations weeks and months. And that was weeks and months where kind of the tools are spitting out alerts that says everyone within the workforce is potentially misusing their authorized access because they're behaving in a way that they weren't a week ago. By the time we got things caught up, it was just about time for everybody to start coming back to work, and normal changed again. Now we're in this kind of hybrid environment where we've realized that kind of the nets we cast over developing these baselines, they have to be kind of really precise and specific, almost to the individual level, for us to have real trust in them. And we also have to recharacterize what we do when we find kind of a detection of something as being potentially anomalous. I think pre-pandemic, we were able to put a lot more of our kind of analytical eggs in that basket of the Venn diagrams between anomalous and something actual suspicious or malicious happening. We're seeing those kind of Venns separate a little bit. So it's kind of recharacterized where anomaly detection fits in the kind of analytical toolkit. And it's also put a lot of emphasis on solution providers to be more transparent about how they do that baselining and how much data we need before we can establish models that say, okay, we're pretty confident that this is what normal looks like now.
Thanks. So maybe to put a capping sort of thought on this, it sounds like the fundamentals remain the same, and that makes sense to me.
Yes.
But the tools and the methods by which you detect malicious insiders need to evolve because the workplace has evolved. The nature of work's evolving, and we need to be vigilant in ensuring that our systems are tuned. I'm sure there's folks in the audience that are operating insider risk, insider threat programs now. It sounds like this is one of the key considerations they should have.
They certainly would. And also the tools have evolved over the past 3 years as well, where traditional tools would be an insider risk analyst telling a tool what to look for. Now with the advent of machine learning, artificial intelligence, the tools are getting better at looking at large data sets, looking for statistical anomalies in those data sets, and informing an analyst what potentially could be anomalous or malicious or suspicious activity as well. So the evolution of technology is now being incorporated into these tools as well.
And what constitutes a good control in insider risk management has also changed. And this has been something that's been fun to watch kind of, pre-pandemic, mid-pandemic, and post-pandemic as well. We published a study years ago about the critical role of positive incentives in managing insider risk, which was effectively groundbreaking in saying that, better places to work, higher levels of engagement, connectedness to your job, and feeling supported by your organization were correlated with a decrease in the occurrence of insider incidents that organizations experience. So, surprise, surprise, better places to work are less likely to have somebody want to maliciously cause harm to them. Now, during the pandemic, what happened? Everyone started experiencing increased levels of personal and professional stressors. as Randy had mentioned earlier, financial stressors, just the kind of the change in kind of what a normal day looked like. And that exacerbated kind of the importance of these kind of administrative controls, better management practices in terms of better supporting the workforce and really driving home kind of where those positive incentives fit when we're thinking about how to apply security dollars to help the organization drive down insider risk. So post-pandemic, now we're back into that kind of hybrid thing. I would argue that we're still experiencing, elevated levels of kind of personal and professional stressors relative to where we were pre-pandemic, but we're seeing kind of increased adoption within insider risk management programs for some of these more softer kind of administrative management HR controls. And I think moving forward that it's always going to have to be a balance of kind of the technical, detection, prevention, response infrastructure, and kind of an increasing adoption of these management practices and thinking of them as having, causal security benefits.
You said something really interesting. You said many things that are interesting, but one thing I'd like to explore in a little more detail. So the World Health Organization says there's an epidemic of loneliness, and certainly during the pandemic and now after the pandemic, some folks are feeling isolated, disenfranchised. You described engagement as key to reducing the risk of malicious insiders. Thoughts about how this new work posture, and maybe the research isn't there yet because it's relatively new, but how does this hybrid world where a portion of the workforce may be physically gathering and having interpersonal interactions, and then maybe you have folks that have never seen the team physically and know you only through the camera on their laptop and Zoom?
I think it changes the balance of kind of what we think of as insider risk management program operations, where historically we've been chasing these alerts from user activity monitoring and data loss prevention capabilities because, some potential exfiltration event has occurred. Whereas as an organization shifts towards adopting these positive incentives, it's more kind of coaching with management and supervisors through the coordination of human resources to get really into kind of the needs of the individual employee, resolving colleague and coworker conflicts, and really accelerating and amplifying the capabilities of a really effective HR function enabled by the technology that we have available to us in 2023 within a modern or modernizing insider risk management program.
Yeah, thanks, Dan.
And it's certainly from the report that Dan mentioned as well, the positive incentive work, working with behavioral psychologists to identify when we can get people connected to their job responsibilities, getting them connected to coworkers, as well as the organization support that's provided, that tends to reduce the risk of insider activity of someone maliciously causing harm against organizations as well. So we had to benefit over the course of the past couple of years of working with psychologists that really focus on the human element of insider risk and then trying to combine that with the ability to use tools to detect both the stressors on the part of the individuals that are behaviorally based stressors, as well as the technical actions they're taking that might be progressing down a path to cause harm to the organization.
One of the most interesting facets of what you do, in my opinion, is this join between the technical and the physical, in the sense that you're talking about the human element in a very overt way. So when folks think of CERT, they often think of things that are purely technical. I know in your bodies of work, you describe the socio-technical, which is a really fascinating element of all this. You mentioned working with psychologists and people that maybe you would think are far afield of cybersecurity, but for your work, they're front and center.
Yeah, they certainly are. When we talk about physical security within a workplace, many organizations are far advanced in incident response when it comes to physical incidents within the workplace. But when an insider incident has a cyber component of that, how do organizations work together with physical security, physical response as well? Because really in the heart of cybersecurity is protecting the availability of a system or service or data, the confidentiality and integrity. So ways by which you can actually put those controls in place to prevent, detect, and respond does have a need of physical security protection, resiliency of the operations of the organization that includes things that are basic, such as power and water and AC that supports the data center. Because certainly if an insider has access to those facilities at a minimum, if they pulled the plug to a machine, that would disrupt the availability of that service as well. So the overlap between the physical and cyber is certainly a critical component of the work that we've done over the years.
I'm going to brag on Randy and my predecessors for a while here because, the first thing you saw from the technologists that were kind of analyzing this kind of cyber crime data in the early 2000s was a really kind of prominent admission that this is a people problem. This is not a technology problem. And this group has worked really closely with social and behavioral sciences for 2 decades to find ways to use technology to amplify the capabilities of those social and behavioral science practitioners. And what you're seeing is that pairing really starting to catch on, not only within the federal government here within the United States, but even into the private sector as well. I'm not saying that, stumble into an insider risk management program and you're going to find a one-to-one between kind of psychologists and, technologists. But you're seeing kind of more government programs having folks within their programs that have that experience. And you're seeing industry kind of follow suit. And where the kind of happy middle ground is a much more prominent inclusion of kind of our HR partners in this type of decision making. Not only the reactive, something terrible has happened, but in that proactive, okay, this person is kind of, starting to display signs of needing some additional attention or support. And I think that's a really interesting kind of progression. And I'm going to just say it. I think it's something that you all kind of, blazed the trail for with kind of the way that you contextualize all this stuff early on.
Yeah, and this progression from insider threat to insider risk is really interesting, which means being expansive in your approach and drawing on those stakeholders' best position to create the conditions to prevent these things, and then not focus just on recovery, but also on prevention. So, Dan, I have a question for you. Unfortunately, the world is full of examples of insider threat scenarios that have resulted in a realized insider threat risk. Now, I know we don't comment on kind of temporary cases, but all of this in sum total led to a number of mandates within federal agencies and the Department of Defense. I know Randy and Dan, the team has been sort of at the forefront of helping to articulate what is organizations in government and the DoD should do, and private industry. Dan, could you describe sort of what the key drivers are there and maybe specific instances where we've helped to determine what the appropriate outlines of a program look like for an agency or our stakeholders in the DoD?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Randy had mentioned, we collect and analyze all of this incident data. We develop these general models of incident progression for a bunch of different misuse cases, right? Whether that's fraud or theft of intellectual property, IT system sabotage. So now that we have an understanding of kind of what these incidents look like and how they tend to evolve, we can then recommend some candidate controls for how organizations can identify that stuff happening within their organizations, as well as, some preventative measures that could have stopped some of those concerning behaviors and activity before the harmful act had actually occurred. So we end up with the series of capabilities, both technical and administrative, that effectively forms the foundation for reference models that we use to help organizations kind of lay out what they need to be doing at the enterprise level to manage insider risk effectively. So we do that, and then a couple of very prominent incidents in the 2011-2012 timeframe kind of hit the papers, and we see the federal government get serious about putting safeguards in place that address some critical capability gaps. So the first thing that happens is an executive order, number 13587, comes out that mandates the safeguards around protecting classified information on classified networks. It establishes a national insider threat policy and minimum standards, which we had the great pleasure of being able to kind of weigh in on and help shape. It also stood up the National Insider Threat Task Force, which was an organization that was effectively the action arm for ensuring that all federal departments and agencies mandated or implemented what was mandated, as well as was the kind of clearinghouse and the concentration of subject matter experts to help organizations stand up these programs. So the executive order, the pursuant National Insider Threat Policy and minimum standards, initially geared towards just the protection of classified networks and classified systems from U.S. government employees. It's augmented in later years by a conforming change to NISPOM, the National Industrial Security Program Operators Manual, and I nailed the acronym.
Well done.
Which basically takes the National Insider Threat Policy minimum standards and brings it over into the defense industrial base space. Provides similar protections for cleared contractors that had the same level of access as our direct government employees. And, that kind of regulatory landscape has really set the foundation for minimum standards for conducting user activity monitoring, for training and awareness, helping the general workforce understand of what these misuse cases look like and what their individual responsibility is in terms of protecting their authorized access to their organization's critical information, past even just classified. So, I mean, that's really kind of what you see in terms of how we got to where we are from a governance perspective, particularly kind of within the federal government and kind of the DIB. Now, private industry has kind of been following along in some of the more heavily regulated sectors, like the financial services and healthcare sectors, have also kind of used those national insider threat policies and minimum standards as kind of proxies for kind of their own set of requirements, guidelines, best practices. So it's really kind of followed that general pattern. Now, obviously, within the healthcare sector, we just replaced classified with protected healthcare information, and within the financial services sector, we replaced classified with PII. But the frameworks are relatively similar.
So, okay, thanks, Dan. I appreciate that. And let's do a thought experiment. So I want you to forget that you are prominent experts in this field and you're new to the subject completely. So let's say you've taken a new job somewhere, and one of the things in your job jar is create an insider threat detection mitigation program. Could you walk us through what the core components of that function are and maybe how folks should get started if they are given this responsibility?
So happy to start. And in this section, Dan and I will kind of go back and forth what we describe as the critical elements of an effective insider risk or insider threat program. For more information, you can go to our Common Sense Guide to Mitigating Insider Threats, the 7th edition, which was released in September of 2022. Best practice number 2 will walk you through how to build a formal insider threat program. So I'll start with critical component number 1, which is developing a formality around the insider threat program, or developing a formal insider threat program. So really at this stage, we want to get executive support, have senior leaders own the program, the ones that have the authority to mandate the participation enterprise-wide across the program and provide information that will provide truly an ability to measure the insider risk within the context of an organization. Now that comes with more formality, which we'll outline in these number of critical components, but it should start thinking about things such as, well, what is the scope of the program? Is it cyber or physical, or overlap between the two? What is the authority of the program? What is in scope and what's out of scope of the program as well? When we operate the program, how far, what are we looking for? How far do we go in terms of things like user activity monitoring? All that should be clearly codified in the procedures, the policies, and the practices, which we'll talk about the critical elements coming up here as well.
Randy, may I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Sorry. So I'm thinking about the first challenge there. So getting executive buy-in or senior leadership buy-in makes sense. There's a governance layer to this. You are going to be monitoring user behavior in a way that may be unusual based on past practices. Thoughts about how you strike that balance between privacy or expected privacy and operating an effective set of insider threat controls?
One of the things we'll talk about is an enterprise-wide approach to building the formality around the insider threat program. And we'll talk about the critical elements, but one of the foremost subject matter experts we want in the discussion is your general counsel, or the legal aspect of your organization, the ability to deploy tools and to monitor with the approval of the general counsel in your organization. Human resources, physical security is part of that as well. So striking a balance truly of what we're doing to protect the critical assets of the organization. Those critical assets do include your people in the organizations and the facilities in which they work, but also the information and technology. So at the heart of it, we're trying to assure the availability, the integrity, and confidentiality of those assets to protect the assets. Now that can include, with the approval of general counsel, an ability to monitor the employee activity within the context of your organization.
Yeah, I mean, so part of formalizing the program is getting an understanding of kind of what already exists within organizations and really unpacking why we need kind of this standalone carved out thing. And one of the reasons why we end up needing that is because historically, traditionally stovepipe parts of organizations like IT, HR, and physical security don't share information freely or proactively without somebody pretty high up the org chart not only requiring them to do so, but actively facilitating that kind of flow of information. So part of the formalization is, okay, this is what we're after in terms of these types of threats to these critical assets. We understand that, all of these different components, information security has this part to play and HR has this part to play, but, to coordinate the proactive kind of response to not only just the bad stuff, but the harm or the concerning behaviors and activity that precede the bad stuff, we need you all kind of talking and doing these things, in a way that isn't necessarily happening kind of organically.
Mm-hmm. So a question then occurs to me. So imagine, again, we're new to this job and we're presented with the incident response plan for the organization, and they call it all hazard. But in truth be told, it focuses on physical disruptions and then purely technical challenges like malware.
Mm-hmm.
Do we need a dedicated insider threat response plan? Should we just simply augment the overall plan with these elements? Thoughts about how best to position insider threat in the realm of incident response?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, let's contextualize it, right? External threat actor doing bad thing, right? We need to make sure everybody knows exactly what's going on at all times, right? If it's a colleague, a coworker, someone whose office is 2 doors down, or someone who you're on Zoom with a couple of days a week, you have to handle the communication of the investigation of that potential incident a little bit differently. It calls for additional kind of confidentiality. It calls for a little bit more precision in terms of how you progress from step to step within kind of an investigation and analysis process. So whether you're doing that kind of within its own standalone policy or playbook from an incident response perspective, or you've got kind of specific and special call-outs within some generalized plan, you've got to consider kind of what has to change when the threat actor is one of your own, because the response options change. It's one of the good things about kind of insider risk management, which is, our response options aren't just disable ports or protocols or throw people in jail. It's get them training, get them help, get them better connected, right? It's it's make the organization a better place to work. So because the range of response options varies so significantly potentially with insider risks as opposed to kind of what you worry about from an external threat actor perspective, that really drives what has to change in your incident response.
So what you're describing is sounding familiar. So prior to the SEI, I worked in private industry, working in IT security and audit. And we had very specific procedures around any financial crime that we encountered, right? If we thought there was fraud or some sort of other nefarious activities, there was a policy and a set of procedures related to the preservation of evidence and privileged communications, and basically ensuring that counsel was involved early on. It sounds like, not to sort of be reductive, but it sounds like the steps you take for an insider risk program are very similar.
Yeah, very similar. Again, it's the protection of the organization's critical assets. So as Dan mentioned, we have models of insiders who intentionally sabotage an IT system. The way you would prevent, detect, and to recover and respond to an IT sabotage incident would be different from someone, as Dan described, someone stealing intellectual property. The goal of this is the remediation, the recovery, and then changing the control stack that you have in place to hopefully reduce the likelihood a similar incident will happen in the future. The same would be true with fraud. And recognizing that an insider who commits the activity with malicious intent may be part of the incident response for that type of incident as well. So building that defense in depth in your incident response is critical when it comes to insider incidents as well.
That's a really interesting one to riff
Yep.
on.
Yep.
There was an incident a couple of years back where an organization that was experiencing a ransomware incident, one of the responders to that ransomware incident had changed the Bitcoin address that was associated with the ransom payment to a wallet that individual had kind of control over, right? So I challenge you to tell me that your incident response plans have that particular vector well covered, unless it's something that you've either explicitly had happen to you, or you've really taken the time to kind of cover your bases from an insider risk management perspective.
It's really interesting. And so that's another lesson, right? Let's build on the past mistakes of others, right? This is the way it works in aviation, for instance, where every accident is seen as a way then to prevent future accidents. So I would say then ensure that those responsible for the crypto wallet don't have some other role where there's a temptation to do this. But I understand there's a limit to checking the checkers. It's really interesting. If you're hearing this for the first time, if you're given the job of standing up an insider risk program, it may seem really daunting and a bit confusing at first. So a question, Dan, What barriers do organizations typically face initially when they're trying to stand up this capability?
Sure. Well, this is a good one to start with, right? Within the federal government space.
Meaning money. Okay.
Within the federal government space, this was an unfunded mandate. I walked you through kind of the executive order and the National Insider Threat Policy and minimum standards, and they said do all this stuff, and no checks got cut. So it was, finding a way to kind of amplify the resources that you already had and be that grease, that coordinating component that kind of help those things share information more effectively and efficiently. So, I mean, let's get past, new programs are expensive and can take time. We also hit on one kind of in the beginning of this too, which is kind of in the formalization of the program. Insider risk is such a broad set of challenges that we kind of house within kind of this one specific area within organizations or this one specific domain. So we see a lot of organizations just struggle with kind of wrapping their head around what that means to them or what specific part of the insider risk problem they are kind of carving off to try to apply some resources to kind of buy down risk in a particular area. So we see organizations struggle with just kind of articulating the scope of the program. And a lot of that also has to do with to clearly articulate the scope of the program, you've got to have a relatively in-depth inventory of kind of what's already in place, right? Because this is meant to be additive, not necessarily repetitive. Matt, you mentioned a good example in your time in the financial services, right? If an insider threat program got stood up within that organization that you were working at, and they didn't do an amazing job checking with the folks that were handling the fraud part, duplicative capabilities. We bought the same tool twice, and now bosses are being called into boardrooms and having to fight about territory and who's responsible for what. Right?
Sorry, is that how insider threat programs wither? Is that they have that duplication of function? And I'm kind of curious. Not only is it the barriers you have to constructing it, but barriers to the operation and enduring way of insider threat programs.
Yeah, we've written a whole paper about this. Effective insider threat programs. Understanding and avoiding potential.
That's available on our website.
It is, yeah. So a couple of themes you'll see in there. I mean, you hit the nail on the head, which is, you've got to have the right metrics and measurements of effectiveness in place. Because it's not just we stop these many pieces of company confidential information from flying out the door. Eventually, as programs mature, that kind of decreases, and you can't rely on that metric without being able to explain that to a board that says, well, it's down, way down, but we're applying the same dollar amount to it as we were. So, finding ways to incorporate all of those different response options that we talked about as kind of success metrics for the program ends up being really important. Another way to really easily erode trust within the program is to do something outside of what's policy, procedure, legal, or it's easy with the tooling and telemetry that's available to kind of get outside of your swim lane. You're a couple of knobs or switches away from doing something that's going to put you in hot water from a compliance perspective. And we've seen organizations, struggle with that, not even necessarily on purpose. They've got a stakeholder within their organization that says, hey, real quick, I know you can see this, so run this for me and let me know kind of if anything comes back. So it can get easy to kind of erode trust in kind of what ends up becoming, a critical asset in and of itself that the organization must protect, which is this aggregated collection of information that insider risk management programs build.
So Dan, let's talk about that temptation to kind of do more with the tools you have and do more in a way that maybe is not appropriate to the mission that the tools were purchased for. So we talked about the decentralized workforce, folks working from home. There's a temptation, and organizations often now are contemplating monitoring their employees for productivity. Thoughts about the division you should have between monitoring for productivity and monitoring for insider risk?
It's a matter of kind of what you do with that analytic and whose hands do you put that into, and has the right set of conversations happen within the organization that says, yeah, we're okay with this being kind of an outcome of this type of analysis. So whether that's kind of measuring for productivity or connectedness or engagement, same question there too, right? Putting that into the hands of an HR practitioner, they say, well, how do we support this person? A different stakeholder in the organization might say, well, they're disengaged. So, they're not next up when we start to build the dream team for this particular project. So it can get, when not very clearly articulated what we use these data sources and analytic capabilities for, it's really easy for those things to kind of go sideways, which is why kind of governance of these programs and having it at the right levels of the organization is so important.
Thanks. So, Randy, shifting gears slightly.
Sure.
So, as a federally funded research and development center, our focus is on national defense and ensuring national prosperity. One of the key goals of an organization like this is transition. So, would you describe to me sort of how we've transitioned the things we've learned about insider threat to our partners in the DoD and elsewhere? And are there specific resources you'd point our audience to if they're contemplating these things for the first time? Or if they're long-term and frequent visitors to your website, are there things that are new that you'd highlight as important?
That's a great question. You mentioned earlier the resources that are available. There's certainly resources that are here within the government, within the work we've done here. The Common Sense Guide to Mitigating Insider Risk version 7 is a great starting point if you're looking to build formality around the program. It identifies 21 best practices organizations can implement as we look to build the controls that can prevent, detect, and respond to insider activity. But there's also a lot of great work that's being done across the federal government. Dan mentioned the National Insider Threat Task Force. They have a lot of great resource available on their website. The DoD Management and Analysis Center, the DITMAC, has done a lot of great work. So a lot of publicly available information as a great starting point. As we look specifically for other resources that we've done, we've published over the years over 125 reports specifically on the topic of insider threat and insider risk. So if you're looking to build a program that's looking to reduce the risk of someone sabotaging your system, an insider doing that, we have reports on IT system sabotage, looking specifically about insider fraud or theft of intellectual property or accidental disclosure of information. There's a lot of information on our website, sei.cmu.edu. A lot of great resources that are available. So that's a great place to start the program. But what if you have a program that's up and running? Well, how do you start measuring the effectiveness of the program? Well, there's a lot of controls that can be put in place that can be measured. We tried to build that into assessment methodologies that we've built that we can train you on, so that we have insider threat vulnerability assessments that we can perform against organizations to see how well they would prevent, detect, and respond. We have insider threat program evaluations that we can do on your organizations. And those same technologies that we can do as an organization against your programs, we can train you how to do that as well. So we have a wealth of information on training that's available as well, such as insider threat program manager training. If you're the program manager, the one that's responsible for the day-to-day operation, we can train you how to implement and operate an insider threat program. Or if you're an analyst in the insider threat program team, we have insider threat analyst training that can be very, very helpful as well. So again, there's a lot of great starting points. I'd also like to mention that we here at CERT and the SEI have a group which is called OSIT, O-S-I-T, the Open Source Insider Threat Information Sharing Working Group. And what that is, over the years, over 300 organizations have got together to share information around building formality around insider threat programs. We get together on monthly phone calls where we just share challenges, successes of building insider threat programs, and really allow the practitioners to talk in a trusted environment around ways by which they've learned from, they've succeeded, they've failed. And it's just a great way to connect with other organizations that are challenged with building insider risk programs in their organization as well. For more information on the OSIT group or the public cases we've talked about, feel free to go to our website. A lot of more information is available on our website that can walk you through how to build, implement, operate, and measure the effectiveness of an insider threat program.
Great. So there's a catalog of things that we have to offer here at CERT. And also, Randy, you piqued my interest with OSIT. How does one become a member of OSIT?
If you want to send an email to either Dan or I, we can get you connected as well. Or we have an insider threat feedback alias that's available on our website. Send us a quick, brief email. You'd like to get connected, and we'll get you an invitation out to join the group.
Great. Excellent. Thank you. So, Dan, a question about what comes next. So AI is the free space in bingo. So I know your answer will include AI in some part and large language models, but can you tell us what's coming next? What's on the horizon for us in insider risk?
A couple of things. I'll broaden the aperture and then we'll narrow down to AI. But we're continuing to assist organizations in the development of kind of evidence-based recommendations for the most effective combinations of data sources, analysis techniques, and response options for the various kind of incident progression components for the incident types that we study. There's a million different ways to make some detections of a particular concerning behavior and activity. So our real deep engineering research in this space is done to identify kind of the best ways to find kind of disgruntlement or data exfiltration or all of the different kind of components of these models that we study. As you mentioned, artificial intelligence is now kind of providing, real promises in this area to help kind of reduce analyst burden, find patterns that would be really hard for humans to be able to identify, standardize and streamline portions of an analysis process, or even, remove analysts from the loop entirely. And our research kind of within this space is designed to help kind of illuminate where the boundaries are for human machine teams, to include those that, use artificial intelligence to wade through, large collections of data, whether that be kind of network sensing data all the way through kind of employee performance review data, to identify, the insider risks that are present within specific organizations. So taking the human out of the loop when deciding on who needs, training, more coaching, support, or having their clearance revoked is probably something that's a bridge too far for the risk appetite of most organizations. So, finding where that line is in terms of what we can and can't let computers kind of do for us, as well as articulating and identifying the biases that are not only present in human analysis within this space, but also when we bring AI to the party, we're just switching out the different types of biases that we have to worry about. So we're doing a lot of work right now partnering with organizations that are kind of trying to lean in to find, the most effective combinations of AI algorithms and data sources to, automate bits and pieces of the analysis and response process. And, through experimental design and kind of executing these experiments, whether that's with synthetic data or, giving them the test plans and letting them do this in their own environments, giving them, empirical bodies of knowledge they can build on to say, if I want to look for this, these are the most effective and efficient ways to do it.
Yeah, thank you. So there's something really interesting, there's several interesting things, but when I think about as we give machines essentially autonomy, as the name would imply, or agency, right? You can imagine us evolving to a point where a source of insider risk that is a trusted entity, in this case, a synthetic entity, could do things that are malicious or unintendedly consequential. So do you think in the future we'll be talking about, you talked about human-machine teaming, we'll be talking about the insider risk posed by AI itself?
Well, we're talking about that internally.
Yeah.
And what we hope to do is follow a very similar pattern to what we used kind of within this organization for getting started with the traditional research within this space, which is amass a body of misuse cases and then use that to build these generalized or generalizable models of incident progression. Now we're going to be talking about kind of applying some very different controls on the other side, but the basic methodology and the process we think is going to be the same. So we'll end up with these kind of general models of kind of incident progression where the threat actor isn't necessarily a person with authorized access to an organization's critical assets, but an artificial intelligence system.
And if I could, Matt, if we could describe this as we apply the AI into the tools and technology, the ethical application of AI, the explainability of AI as well. Because if you think about this being the detection of an insider threat, that is potentially identifying an individual. How can we explain why that trigger generated alert on this individual? Is that something we can justify to our human resources or to our general counsel as well?
Or to a court.
Or to a court.
Right, which is important test in all this, absolutely.
Very, very important. And I think about insiders that potentially could influence the data that's being provided to the AI engines. Could that data be poisoned from an insider to then avoid detection of future insider incidents as well? So as Dan mentioned, these are things we're thinking about. We'd love to partner with organizations to continue that evolution of our research and love to work with organizations on the application and transition of that thought and that thought process as well.
There's another really key component to kind of where I think we're going next and kind of where I think this domain is going next. I mentioned the kind of critical role of positive incentives here. And we've got early research out there that establishes these kind of correlative relationships. Right? There's more work to do to drive towards kind of causal understanding of kind of reframing these management practices as security controls. I think another really key component to that is, us doing a much better job kind of as a domain at kind of being able to quantify these risks and being able to drive towards kind of return on risk investment calculations that allow us to measure, re-upping the license for the DLP tool versus, bringing in some executive coach that's going to also slip a couple of security sweet nothings into the ears of our folks with authorized access.
That's really interesting.
So we're breaking ground in other parts of CERT in terms of how we're kind of tackling this problem of cyber risk quantification. And we're partnering very closely with those folks to, as they kind of crack some new code, find ways to adapt that to this. And, the positive deterrence stuff, because it's management practice focused, that's going to require its own set of kind of dimensions that we need to factor in. So it's another real key area of kind of growth for us in the future.
Thanks, Dan. So if you want to connect with the team, if our audience wants to connect with the team, and I don't mean Digital Dan or Robo Randy, we have an event coming up in September, do we not? A symposium?
Do.
Could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, September, National Insider Threat Awareness Month. This will be year 4 of September being National Insider Threat Awareness Month. It'll be year 9 for our Insider Risk Management Symposium. So this year, we're excited to get that back in person. We'll be in our Arlington offices, really just bringing practitioners, researchers across government, industry, and academia together to talk shop, to get a sense of kind of what's new, what organizations are struggling with, and what organizations are being successful with as the threat landscape changes and as these new challenges surface and emerge. So the last 2 of these have been YouTube events, and we're excited to get back in person.
Well, excellent. Well, Dan, Randy, thank you so much for the discussion today. Really enjoyed the conversation. I'm sure our audience has found many things that can help them influence and inform the way they construct insider threat programs. There'll be links in the transcript that will take you to the artifacts that Dan and Randy have named. Final reminder to our audience, these podcasts are available on SoundCloud, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, Google Podcasts, as well as the SEI's YouTube channel. If you've liked what you saw today, please give us a thumbs up. And Randy and Dan, thanks again for this conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for joining us. This episode is available where you download podcasts, including SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. It is also available on the SEI website at sei.cmu.edu/podcasts and the SEI's YouTube channel. This copyrighted work is made available through the Software Engineering Institute, a federally funded research and development center sponsored by the U.S. Department of Defense. For more information about the SEI and this work, please visit www.sei.cmu.edu. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email us at info@sei.cmu.edu. Thank you.